All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. Uh, just a reminder, uh, we're going to finish today the book on thinking, and we take a week off, and we'll start Willing, and get a little bit into it before we take some time off in August. Just I think most of you know this, but we usually have our membership drive coming up in late July. One of the many privileges of being a member of the center is the ability to join this reading group, which we love and love having you be part of. We are going to try and get some new members, and one of the best way to do that is to explain to people why membership matters and why it's worth being a member. Since you guys are some of our most loyal members, we thought we'd ask you to help us with that. A, of course, you can recommend to your friends to join. B, Alex was going to put in the chat again, because I think, Alex, you have to put in it again, a link to a short Google form where you can offer a testimonial to why membership in the center and the reading group is important or meaningful to you. And we would love you to do that, and it will help us in our attempt to recruit new members and help us do what we do. So thank you very much. And if you have a chance to click on that form and save it, and some point in the next week or so, fill it out, that would be something we'd very much appreciate. So thanks for that. We are, as I said, about to finish the book on thinking. This is of the three parts that the life of the mind was to comprise: thinking, willing, and judging. Um, Thinking is the one that Arendt gave in numerous lecture courses. It's the one that she really worked on the most, and I think um, at least in at the point in which she was, it was the most thought out and the most relevant. I mean, as we said in the very beginning uh, of this book, uh, one of the major questions, right, was, can thinking in some way prevent the doing of evil? And so the life of the mind is very much governed in her own imagination, I think, by the question of thinking. Um, and and yet willing and judging are also deeply important. The book on willing, which we'll read next, she did finish, and it's about a topic that we should all care about, uh, care very much about, right? Which is freedom. As many of you know, freedom is at the very heart of what Arendt is doing in her life, in her work. I think when I first really started reading Arendt, or reading and thinking and writing about Arendt seriously, and people would say, "Well, why should I read Hannah Arendt?" I would say, "Well, because she's the greatest thinker of freedom that ever lived." And I still believe that. And so, while she wrote many great books about freedom and essays, including "What Is Freedom," which we've read, the section on willing is in many ways her one of her highest meditations on the question of human freedom, and we're going to get to that. The question on judging really goes to the core of her politics, um, and as a result, would have been incredibly important. And we have other texts that she wrote on judging, including her lectures on Kant. So we have a sense of where she was going with it, but she never finished it. In any case, this book on thinking is unique. It's unlike, whereas the willing section, has been written about in her other works on the question of freedom, and the judging chapter, which she didn't write here, is something she spent many years thinking and writing about. Her reflections on thinking in this book are truly special and unique. And she asks herself, right, over and over again, right, what is the importance of thinking? Um, and she doesn't, and she wants to be very clear that it's not useful. Um, in a sense, it's not going to achieve anything. And so in this last section of the book on thinking, the fourth chapter of the book on thinking, um, she begins with a quote from Paul Valéry. Uh, I'm gonna butcher it in French. I don't even know how to say it. Tantôt je pense, tantôt je suis. Now I think, now I am. And uh, I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. But she says that, if we want to review what we've been doing, um, we can come up with four propositions that we've developed in this course on thinking that she's given. And she says, by saying them as propositions, I'm going to they're going to seem dogmatic. They're going to seem like things I'm telling you, but they're not. They're all fundamentally insights that she takes from her experiential inquiry. The first is something we've had occasion to talk about over and again. Thinking is out of order, right? This is, I think, one of the most fundamental insights of Arendt's. Um, and it comes, she develops it in many ways, but I think in the end for Arendt, it comes from her reading of Socrates. Near the beginning of Plato's Symposium, if you'll remember, if you've read the Symposium, Aristodemus arrives at Agathon's house where the symposium is to be held, a celebration for the dinner party. And he had been walking with Socrates, but he explains that Socrates stopped in the middle of the street and was just thinking. And Socrates had needed to collect himself or gather his thoughts. And Agathon, who's upset that Socrates is late, says, go get him. And everyone says, no, let him be. It's a habit of his. He often just stops where he is and stands there thinking. Alcibiades, near the end of the symposium, returns to this idea and recounts a story from when he and Socrates were together during the campaign at a battle, the Pithidaian campaign. And he said that the troops were amazed that sometimes in the middle of a battle, Socrates would just stand there and let the hours pass and be in thought until he finally, at the end of his thought, as Alcibiades says, after a full day and night, when the sun rose again, he prayed to the sun and then walked away. And so this was a habit of Socrates to stop and think. And this stop and think becomes almost a kind of mantra of Arendt's. It's one she repeats over and again in many of her books, and in this book in particular. The idea is that thinking is out of order. It interrupts processes. It interrupts movements. It's meaningful, right? She asks back at the beginning in the introduction, could the activity of thinking as such be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing or even actually condition them against it? And it's this stopping and think when everyone else is fighting the battle, right? Engaged, to stop and think frees you from what everyone else is doing, from convention, from the sort of what everyone is, from what everyone is doing, and allows you to be independent, to be thoughtful, to be autonomous. And it's this out of orderness of thinking. I think that for Arendt is one of the absolute central ideas. The The second proposition that she offers as a way of review is that there are many ways that the thinking ego manifests itself. But she wants to say that this thinking ego, right? This thing that I think, whatever it is, when I think, um, it doesn't, it's out of order in the world. Um, it's based on a fallacy, on a semblance, what she calls it, this metaphysical semblance or metaphysical fallacy, namely that there's this thinking ego, right, which is nowhere, which is alone, a fictitious being, that we live in complete solitude. That when I think I'm sort of this abstract entity cut off from my gender, my body, my race, my history, my religion, everything else. And she thinks that living beings, all living beings, but also human beings, have this urge to display themselves, to be seen by others, to appear. But in thinking, we withdraw into this sort of thinking ego, which is nowhere, which is invisible. And this withdrawn thinking ego, which never appears, is on the one hand doesn't exist because she thinks that all living beings have an urge to exist, and yet it's also real. And so it's a semblance, it's a fiction, but she calls it an authentic fiction. Um, it's what Kant calls the Ding an sich, or Descartes would call the sort of this pure mind, pure thinking. Um, and it's the source of this hierarchy that in philosophy has set being over appearance. We think this thinking ego as in a way superior to our real selves. And yet Arendt wants us to imagine that that's not necessarily the case, and yet still hold on to the meaningfulness of this fiction, of the thinking ego. She here adds the Chinese story told by Chuang Tzu about Chung Chao, right? Who dreamt he was a butterfly and didn't know he was Chung Chao. And suddenly he woke up and he was Chung Chao. And was he Chung Chao dreaming of a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming of Chung Chao? And she adds to this that the intensity of the thinking experience, right? Thinking in this semblance of this fictional self is so powerful and so intense, um, that we can actually erase reality. We can make the real world seem fake. We can make the thinking world seem more real than the real world. Um, and and this leads to the kind of Hegelian claim, right? That what is thought is, and what is what is thought. Um, that in a sense, this radical idealism that thinking is more important than reality, and that's the elevation of being over appearing. For her, this can be a nightmare, right? In the sense that we free ourselves from reality and we end up in this totalitarian nightmare of ideology. But it can also be consoling, to the extent that the world is unbearable. The Stoics, the Romans and the Stoics offer this idea that we can simply live in our thoughts and turn the world off to a certain extent. The third proposition is that thinking is a withdrawal and deals in absences and thus desenses the world. It's a full we leave the world of particulars and we aspire to the general, to the universal. And thus thinking is a kind of homelessness. Aristotle, she says, is one of the quintessential thinkers. He was kicked out of Athens and ended up back in Macedonia. And she says that he embraced this sort of homelessness, this cosmopolitan nature, that that thinking takes place amongst a universal humanity, not amongst things or particulars. We had a conference last year at the Arendt Center on cosmopolitanism and tribalism. And in many ways, it's the philosophers who are the cosmopolitans, who are home everywhere, but also have the danger of course, being at home nowhere in this sort of desensed, deracinated, desexed world. And so she ends this reflection really on thinking, with this discussion of Paul Valéry's statement, right? That that I'm at home, that now I think and now I am. Um, there's a sort of beauty to this, in a sense, reworking of Descartes' um, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Remember that for Descartes, I think, therefore I am is not a syllogism. It's not a logical claim. It's still for him also an experiential claim. It's in the experience of thinking that I find myself existing. It's a finding and thus not a logical deduction. But what Valéry, I think, adds to it, and I think the reason Arendt turns to it here, is a temporal element, right? That in this now I think, now I am, there's a way in which thinking is discursive. There's the two nows. There's a way in which there's a rhythm. Now I think, now I am. It's almost poetic. And it's at this end of her book on thinking, which says we don't expect a conclusion about thinking, but we understand that thinking is this activity, not an end outside of itself. The metaphor for thinking, she says, is simply to be alive without a purpose or goal. But in this rhythmic repeat, now I think, now I am, we find a temporality to thinking, that sort of something that happens when, now, in the present. And this is the transition to the last chapter of the book on thinking, which is on the gap between past and future, the Nunstans, the standing now. And those of you who've read Between Past and Future, and the preface to it, as well as the rest of the book, because it becomes a repeating theme in it, you'll have a strong sense of what she's after here. But she wants to say that thinking is not a spatial idea, but a temporal idea. You know, why temporal and not spatial? I think that there's a kind of sense that all spatial ideas are a little too firm and set in a place or something, and that's why it's really not a question of where am I when I think, but when am I when I think. And this is why the Paul Valéry line is important as a transition. We think in the now. And she says that in ordinary life, we have the past, the present, and the future, and we follow this smooth continuum. But since thinking withdraws and is out of order, it interrupts this continuum, right? And in thinking and reflecting about things, I realize that the past is absent. It's something that's beyond, it's behind me, and it's not here now. And the future is not yet. It's in front of me, and it's also absent. And so she says that the activity of thinking, which is like being alive, is a fight against time. It's a fight against continuity. And I think the reason she chooses time over space is she thinks it's easier to think the now as a space of contest between the past and the future, as the, I guess, here as a contest between what, the there, and I mean, there, it's less, spatiality seems less divisible than temporality because we have the three tenses. And so the activity of thinking is this fight against continuity, fight against time. time in its everyday sense of continuity is the enemy of the thinking ego. Because remember, the thinking ego is this absolute entity, which is almost outside of time and space and everything else. It's ageless, timeless, placeless. It's an interruption. And so here she begins to develop this idea of the gap between past and future, this space, this temporal moment between past and future, this battle between past and future, and the place of the battle as the activity of thinking. And she, as we all know, uses a number of metaphors and parables to explore this idea of the gap, the temporal gap, both in between past and future, and also in the life of the mind. The main one being Kafka's parable of He, and the parable describes this he who's here and gives battle to the past, which pushes forward, and the present, which pushes back. And he's stuck in the middle, fighting them both. She says that this describes poetically the time sensation of the thinking ego. The thinking ego is the person free from the future, free from the past, who's battling it out in the now. It's this inner state, she says, with respect to time when we are thinking, when we've withdrawn from the world of appearance. When we are thinking about thinking, the past and the future are absent, but are present as these forces which impinge upon us. And so it's this being in this now, what Nietzsche will call the Augenblick, the glimpse of the now, of the moment, which is coeval with what man is as a thinking being. It's the path paved by thinking. And she says that every new generation and every human being must discover and plot anew this path of thinking. How do we move in this gap? How do we think in this gap? She says we need to learn to talk together, to thrive amidst the elementary problems of human living together. The assumption here, right, and she now makes this explicit, the assumption underlying this is that metaphysics is over. And by saying that metaphysics is over, what she means is that the thread of tradition has been broken. The Roman trinity of authority, tradition, and religion, which provided what tradition, right, means the carrying over of. It provides a thread linking the past and makes it seem like every new age and every new moment comes out of the last one. That's what metaphysics does for her. It provides a principle, a beginning in which the end is contained. It suggests that there's a continuity and there's this time structure. And one of the things that tradition and metaphysics do is it makes it unnecessary for most of us to think. Right? That's a point she makes very clearly in her essay, What is Authority? As long as authority is alive, most people don't have to think because they live in this continuous world that makes sense. The assumption of much of Arendt's thought, right, is that this tradition is broken. And it's been broken by a number of things, but ultimately by totalitarianism and the horrors of the Holocaust in Germany and the sort of pogroms and not pogroms, the killings of so many people in the Soviet Union. The sense that fundamentally that thinking has broken its bounds of continuity and has become an ability to simply make a fully new, coherent, ideological, totalitarian world that is fundamentally controlled by the will of the totalitarian leader. And so you lose the continuity of the past. And it's at that moment, she says, that in a sense, thinking uh no longer is simply something done by the few, but now is almost required by the many, because we now live in a world in which the world doesn't make sense. The tradition doesn't paper over the gaps, and we all have to struggle with the gaps. Um, the temptation in such a world, right, is coherence, is ideology. Uh, the temptation is to believe in a movement and identify with a movement that makes sense of the world, because the loss of tradition is so terrifying. Um, and yet, what Arendt says is we need to learn to think. That's why the book Between Past and Future is such an important book in Arendt's work, because it's what she calls exercises in thinking. It's how we learn to think in this time of the break of tradition. And so here she says, we have to learn to be comfortable with fragments, right? We have to learn to be okay with the fact that the world doesn't make sense, and yet still find meaning in those fragments. Um, and she here cites Shakespeare's The Tempest, uh, this wonderful these wonderful lines um about how to play and make sense with fragments. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Um, we mine, we dive for the pearls of the past, as she says in her essay on Walter Benjamin. Um, and we pull up these fragments, these pearls of the past, and they change their meaning for us. Uh, um, we 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 use them in some sense, but she says that we could use them at all, we owe to the no time track which thinking beats into the world of space and time. Um, we're able to pull these out and make them meaningful for us, but that doesn't mean we should have full authority over them, right? She says if some of you should be tempted to try their luck at the technique of dismantling, tearing apart the fragments and saying they just don't make any sense, she says, let them be careful not to destroy the rich and strange. We still need to find the rich and strange, the coral and the pearls, which can only be saved as fragments. And when you do dismantle all of them and leave us adrift with no meaning, that's, of course, when totalitarianism can emerge. And then she ends finally with these lines from Auden, including this last prose quote in which he says, some books are undeservedly forgotten, none are undeservedly remembered. And here's her appeal, I think, that even amidst the death of metaphysics, there are fragments that are great, that even though they don't fit in a coherent story, they are so profound, these books, these artworks, these songs, these heroic deeds, that they are worthy of being the pearls that we change, that we work with in a way that's both fragmented and continuous. And that's what thinking allows us to do today, to build a world of meaning in a world that has lost its meaning in many ways. Uh, the last pages here, section 21, are called transition. and they are a transition to what was going to be the next two parts of the books, and it's currently just the next one part of the book on willing. Um, uh, there's a lot to say, and we'll say much more about it as we start to read the willing section. I think what I want to say for today is simply this. Um, willing and judging are like thinking mental activities. Um, willing is the it concerns what is not yet, the future. We will the future. Judging is an evaluation of the past, and thinking is this meaning making activity that can mine the past in fragments, but is in the end about the present, the gap, the battleground, the attempt to um, make something meaningful now. Um, insofar as thinking is concerned with the now, in this way in which it pulls things out of their history and context, that it deals with things that are not present, that are in the past or in the future, that it deals with generalizations and it desenses things and pulls them out of their context and annihilates the real and destroys all criteria. Thinking is separated from the everyday. It loses and it's at war with common sense. Whereas both willing, which is a will for the future, and judging and evaluation of the past concern actual things in the world, particulars, and thus are much more concerned with common sense. Um, uh, thinking is the danger of thinking is that it's free from the world and common sense. The promise of thinking is that it's free from the world and common sense, and thus allows us a kind of autonomy that is beyond what is to be found in either willing or judging. Now, that said, Arendt wants to preserve autonomy for both willing and judging too, since they are thinking activities. Even though they deal with particulars and others closer to appearance, um, they're not simply logical activities, and they're not governed by the world. Right? Willing is going to be about freedom. It's what she calls a coup d'etat, a spontaneous will. It comes from nowhere. It's not governed by reason, right? Contra Plato. Um, and thus, she says, the Greeks never had an idea of freedom in that sense, nor did the Romans. I mean, freedom was, yeah, to be not a slave, but they didn't have the idea of freedom as a willful rejection of reason, a rejection of the good. The Greeks thought, the good, you're not going to reject the good. Why would you do that? And so there is a sense in which she says freedom is discovered, and it's discovered later than any of the other ideas. It's discovered in Christianity, specifically by Saint Paul. Saint Paul, who said, I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I'm supposed to want the good, but I don't do it. I'm a human. I'm a man, and I do what I hate, the bad. And this split between reason and the will begins with the Christians. And she says this is the beginning of human freedom as a mental faculty, and in the book on willing, we're going to follow that through to its, the worry, of course, is that this freeing of man's will from reason is one of the potential sources of evil. And so that's what we will be thinking and reading about in the section on willing. The section on judgment is also on the one hand saying that judging much more so than thinking is tied to the world and to particulars, but not to logic, not to rules, but in a sense to common sense, to a sense of how to evaluate things that have happened, events in the past, without rules, without being told how to do it, and it's without standards or criteria. She calls it this silent sense that can't be taught. It can only be learned through practice. You don't have to be educated for it. And she says, in fact, sometimes the best, most reliable judgment is offered by people who are uneducated. You don't, and this is one of the reasons Arendt really does believe that politics doesn't require education. To be a good politician doesn't require that you've been educated. You just have to have good judgment, which means you really have to have common sense. You have to be able to evaluate things in line with the public, but not simply giving in to what everyone else says, not conventionality. You have to have a kind of autonomy in your judgment, but one that is free. She says that there are really two alternatives here. One is to be governed by what she calls success or history. Whatever happens is what God wanted to happen or what reason determined to happen, and therefore it is just. This is the conclusion of Hegel in his philosophy of history when he says, die Weltgeschichte ist die Weltgericht. World history is the world court. Whatever happens in the world must have been what reason, for Hegel, determined, and therefore what is what ought to be. This takes away our autonomy. It makes us subject to sort of the laws of history or the accidents of history, depending on how you look at it. And Arendt says that the other alternative, and for her a better one, comes from the very idea of history in the Greek word of telling a story, history, which means, as Herodotus says, to say what is. And she says that from Homer, to say what is simply to judge, in your opinion, and it reclaims our human dignity. The question is, how do you judge, not according to history, not according to convention, but in a way that even if not everyone realizes that they agree with you, helps them to see that they should agree with you, and in a sense brings them along with you. That's great judgment for Arendt. It's got an aesthetic element to it. It sort of it woos people, as she says in her lectures on Kant's political thinking, and that's a different kind of mental activity, not thinking itself, and yet also connected to it. So that's the outline of the next two books, one of which is written and one of which is not. And it leads us to our reading of Thinking, which will begin in 2 weeks. I'll just end. She ends by going back to Cato, right? If you remember that the whole inquiry begins with her citation of Cato, who says, "I'm never more alone. I'm never less alone than when I'm alone, and never more." I always forget it. Thinking, I think, when I'm by myself, or no, with people when I'm thinking. And now she cites Cato at the end. The victorious cause pleased the god, right? But it's the history argument. Weltgeschichte ist Weltgericht, right? But the defeated one pleases Cato, right? I can love losing causes, and I can say the lost cause is better than the winning cause. I don't have to give in to history. And that is how she ends the book on Thinking. All right, I'll stop there. We have time for discussion, and I look forward to it. Remember, you can enter the discussion. So get the tattoo of Cato. Great. Thanks, Jason. You can enter the discussion either through the chat, which please be respectful, and I'm sure you will be at this point. Or you can go down to the react button and raise your hand and engage that way. Look forward to talking about thinking. Anything's on the table from the thinking section. We finished the book, and love to have a wide-ranging discussion about what the book means and why thinking matters. Susan, you're up.
So maybe I missed it, but you said there were 4 propositions that have been developed, and I only got 1, 2, and 3. So I'm not sure what number 4 was.
Yeah. So she mentions 3. I sort of suggested that the 4th was the Paul Valery quote. Now I think, now I am. And then and how that moves us towards the temporality of thinking. But you're right. She only actually identifies 3 as the, as sort of clear propositions. I was simply adding that in my reading, but you can ignore that if you want.
Thanks.
Yeah, but good question. Sometimes look, she says 3, but then she goes on for 3 more pages, and one can say, all right, what's she doing here? I was simply trying to say that there's sort of a 4th move in this text, which is the transition to temporality, and that was the 4th one. Lee.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Back to the this notion of the 2 and 1, that you can't be out of agreement with yourself when you come home. You're facing someone in this interior dialogue that you have to offer accounts to. And while it can't prevent some people from evil, can you turn that around 180 degrees and, let's say, assume a person who is bent on doing the right thing witnesses a huge amount of corruption in their daily life, and they come home and this partner says to them, look, everybody is corrupt, stealing stuff. You should engage in similar actions to survive. The same rationale can be used to justify perhaps war crimes by soldiers who were asked to carry out an action, and they convince they end up saying, well, everybody else is doing it, which is attributed to Eichmann as a sort of thoughtlessness. So I just wanted to see how Arendt might respond to that argument that the 2 and 1 is not a sufficient antidote to doing evil or doing wrong in the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, after the last session last week, when we were talking about this, I got an email from someone saying, what happens if when you go home, your other self is a monster?
Yeah.
And it's a good question. What I said then and my inclination to say now is, it's possible, but can you live with a monster, right? Arendt's point is that you have to live with this person. And you could say, well, yeah, I can live with a monster, but it means you always have to live with the monster. That means every time you come home, you know, your your brother or your sister has, you know, uh gotten the shirt you wanted for Christmas and you got the ball you didn't want, you got to take it, right? I mean, do you always want, are you going to be able to live with that monster who in a sense inverts conscience? Um uh and maybe the answer is yes. I mean, I think Arendt believes there are monsters, right? When she says that Eichmann was not a monster, and I don't think she ever, I mean, I know she never says that there are no monsters. I think there are. But I believe that she thinks that most people are not. Um, and I think she believes that Eichmann um had a person at home who was not a monster. What he did is he turned it off. He hid it behind cliches and um and a kind of superficiality and bureaucracy and evasions. And what she says is the reason we use cliches and superficiality and evasions is because we have this other person at home who, if we ever actually talk to them, would be like, dude, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And and so you're right. You know, I think there are people who have monsters at home, but I think they're very few. I mean, and you know, and this is just a question you have to ask yourself about, you know, most people. If you think that there are people doing terrible things in the world, right? Some of them may actually be monsters. But I think a lot of them, or at least, you know, again, this is just my reading of the world. A lot of them are people who would rather be doing good things, but are finding it inconvenient to do good things right now. And it's not that they now think what they're doing is good, but they sort of turn off their other person, their two and one. They stop talking to them. They hide themselves in ideology and cliches and I have to do this, it's my job, banalities, and they make excuses. But I don't think most people want to do bad things.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yep. I mean, you know, and I think there are, you know, you may think, no, there are a lot of monsters. Most people are monsters. I generally believe most human beings are good people. That they want to do, most people want to treat people with dignity and respect. That doesn't mean they always do, but I think they generally do it out of thoughtlessness and need to get ahead and other excuses. And that when the spell breaks, they're embarrassed for what they did.
Yeah.
Julie. And by the way, what you know, that's what I think. Doesn't really matter. I think that's what Arendt thinks, right?
Okay.
You know, I mean, yeah, Julie.
Hello. I'm interested in the stop and think question, and also the idea of the linearity of the time as opposed to a more three-dimensional space in terms of where you're thinking from. It seems to me that she prefaces always appearance over being, and yet you step outside of appearance in order to think. Whereas personally, I find that I'm thinking and appearing continuously. You said earlier that the reason why she chooses the linearity of time over space is because it has a structure. It is able to be divided into the past, the now, and the future, whereas spatiality is not able to be qualified in that kind of a way. At the end of it, she comes to talking about the fragments and about the pearls. And I'm wondering whether or not this idea of stopping and thinking, which is so prevalent throughout her writing, has more to do with that sort of respect given to the whole past philosophy, everything that's happened before, rather than it being based in an idea of experience. Because the stop and think, and she refers quite often back to Socrates, takes you away from her idea of appearance as being the prime motivator. And is that too complicated? One way you might be able to say it sort of very simplistically is when Socrates stopped to think, were his eyes open or were they closed? Like, how could he ignore appearance at that time of stopping to think?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. Just to start at the beginning and the most basic level, right? You said you think that when you're thinking, you're appearing, or I think that's what you said. For Arendt, thinking can't appear. And this is a paradox or a problem. Why? Because thinking is abstracted from the world. Thinking deals with universals. Thinking deals with, a thinking ego is not me here in this body, in this place, in this time, in this world, but is sort of, I'm thinking 2 + 2 = 4 in the ether somewhere. Thinking, and this is why it's such a challenge to portray thinking in art or in movies or in poetry. What is it? How do you what's a metaphor for thinking, right? She says, well, being alive. How do you show it, right? And in many of the movies about Hannah Arendt, this is a question, like, how do you show thinking? It's just not an easy thing to show, because our idea of thinking is something that's not connected to any particular person or body or place or time. And so this is part of the challenge for her of thinking, to be is that thinking really doesn't appear, and is in fact somewhat antagonistic to and even destructive of the appearing world, insofar as it can free itself from it and remake it in different ways.
Is it possible that it's a difference between thinking of thinking as sort of like an object as opposed to an activity? Because, and thinking of appearance as an object rather than as being part of an activity. Because, and I think this is more what I was asking, was the activity of thinking can happen at the same time as the activity of appearing and of receiving appearance. And perhaps this is what happens with art, is that it ends up being that sort of congealing of the thinking activity in appearance.
Yeah, I mean, again, Arendt separates thinking from making art. Now, what she does say is that art can't be made without thinking, right? You can't be an artist if you don't think. But once you start making the art, you're stopping thinking, and you're now doing, acting, making something. She holds on to this idea of thinking as really, when Socrates walks down the street or in the middle of the battle, just stops and thinks. Yeah, his body is there, but his mind is who knows where. And that's thinking for her.
Thank you.
Yeah. Vigdis.
Yeah, I have some comment or some questions about the relation between thinking and language. And I just want she quotes Wittgenstein, two sentences that I think is relevant. The one is, the results of philosophy are the discovery of bumps the intellect has got by running against the limits of language. And also, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And Arendt comments on that last one with, the trouble is, of course, that this battle can be fought again only by means of language. And I want to relate that to what she says in the Denktagen book. And there she says, and this is from April 1970, and she says that all thought starts and departs from everyday speech. The need to think arises whenever we find that words, taken in their ordinary sense, are obscuring rather than revealing. The process of clarification that occurs in the thinking process comes about through distinctions. So I wonder, it is this relation, thinking goes on in language. At the same time, there has to be some kind of creativity, because you use the language you have, but at the same time, you have to create these distinctions, for instance. Do you have any thoughts about this relation, how she sees it, the relation between thinking and language?
Well, I mean, we've talked a lot about the relation between thinking and language, Vigdis, right? I mean, she thinks we can only think in language. There is no, and this is what, so to go back to, the earlier question, this is what connects thinking back to the world of appearances, right? Is that we don't think in universal symbols. We're not some entity that can think outside of language. You know, it'll be interesting to think about AI. Can AI one day think outside of language? Will it develop, you know, I mean, computer code, insofar as it's all ones, zeros and ones or whatever, you know, it's still a language, but it's a much more abstract language. Mathematical symbols is a language, but it's a much more abstract language that has very little connection to things in the world. But but humans think in words. I mean, some mathematicians think in symbols, and so there is some, that's about as close as you get to getting out of that. But to the extent we humans think in words, and thus in language, we're connected to words that have a sense of the real world, and that holds us to the world. And even things that we want to think that are completely outside the world, like that we've never seen, like justice or courage, we think through metaphors, which she says are the bridges that carry us back between the most abstract thinking we do and the world. Will one day we be able to think beyond language if we merge with some sort of artificial intelligence that allows us to all, you know, I don't know, sense what other people are sensing without words? I can't imagine that. But that doesn't mean I think it's impossible, but I don't know. I mean, I think even, at least AI, is, so far as we're using it with ChatGPT, is still in language. Although, I mean, I don't think it knows what that language means. So it's not clear how to, I mean, that's, you know, I mean, again, this gets to very interesting questions about AI. Insofar as AI still looks at language and patterns, but it's based on code that is not based in, that doesn't sort of understand the meaning of the words, but just their relation to each other, or does it? I mean, again, these are really important questions that I think we're all struggling with, to the extent we use or trying to understand how AI works. you know, when you ask ChatGPT a question and it answers, it's hard to imagine that it doesn't know what these words mean, because its answers are incredibly meaningful and often poetic. And yet we know that ChatGPT is just a bunch of code saying, you know, when these words are used, it could mean this and that, and yet somehow it ends up using language. It's a very, I mean, I find this to be mind blowing right now. And not really sure how to make sense of it personally. But yeah, I don't know much. I don't know if you want me to say more, or that's what I
Yeah,
would.
I was most about the creativity in our thinking, when, especially when this part, when she says that words taken in the ordinary sense are obscuring rather than revealing, and that the process of clarification that occurs in the thinking process comes out about through distinctions.
Oh, I'm not sure, Vignes, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by creativity. What are you asking?
How we kind of critique, we think in language, at the same time we have a critical distance to the language we use. That means that we can in a way say that there is something that's the relation between the words we use and the meaning they have, the relation between the words, how they are used, and the world we live in doesn't fit together. And I'm quite interested in how the thinking process goes then to reveal this kind of mismatch between the language we use and what's happening in the world. That's the thing I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as, I mean, the mismatch. I mean, if we want to judge what's happening in the world, that's judgment, right? And and that's not thinking per se. It's, I mean, it requires us looking back at what's happened and speaking a judgment of it. And so the kind of critical distance that you're talking about is often, I mean, it would normally be, I think, under her approach, understood according to judgment. That said, the very act of freeing ourselves from the world and allowing ourselves to flights of fancy and thinking things that aren't in the world, that's thinking. And there's a creativity to thinking, no doubt. To think a unicorn or to think an honest politician requires creativity. And that's what we do in thinking. I'm
Okay.
not sure I'm getting to your question, but I'm not sure I understand it. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay.
I'll think more about it.
All right. Hannah.
Hi, oh, just, I did just put a link to an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about how AI is like, I can't even remember exactly what the title is. Hold on a second. AI is learning to escape human control. Models rewrite code to avoid being shut down. I put the link in for people just because I thought it was crazy. Roger, my question is, I'm just curious, I don't know if this is way afield, but I was just wondering what your take would be on how do you think Arendt would respond to the postmodernist approach to thinking, you know, which sort of appeared like around 1970, right when Arendt was leaving us.
that there's like no objective reality, that there's no scientific or historical truth, that everything is contingent, et cetera. I'm just curious, how do you think she would react, or do you have any thoughts of that or not?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Hannah. I mean, postmodernism is not a meaningful term. I mean, it encompasses so many different thinkers and so many different ideas that
Say Derrida and Foucault, let's
yeah.
just say those
Uh,
two.
So Arendt allies herself here with what she calls the people who believe that metaphysics is over, right?
Oh, I didn't understand at all what you said about that.
Okay. Well,
I thought it was really interesting, but I didn't really
okay.
process it. I would love for you to explain it a little bit more.
Right. So she says on page 193 of the critical edition, near the end of the last of chapter 20, right? She says, I have clearly joined the ranks of those who for some time now attempt to dismantle metaphysics and philosophy with all its categories as we have known them from the beginning in Greece until today. Now, who are the ranks she's joining? I mean, above all, it's Martin Heidegger, but also Sartre and Camus and Bergson and Merleau-Ponty and others. What they are saying, right? What these folks are saying is that the sort of Western tradition of philosophy, in its coherence, which has existed for 2,000 years, no longer provides the answers that we wanted, or that it thought it could provide. There's not going to be, a metaphysical truth, or God, or idea that governs all society and from which we can derive all of our judgments and all of our moral and ethical and political maxims. That and so Arendt fully disowns this claim that there's one idea of being, and that this one idea of being, if we know it, will tell us how to act and what is right and what is wrong.
So could you
and-
call her a postmodernist?
So as I said, I find the word postmodernist unhelpful.
Okay.
Um, uh, someone like, the point is that what Heidegger does, right, is look at the thinkers of metaphysics and show the contradictions that run through their thought, right?
Yeah.
That's different from what philosophers before Heidegger did, who tried to draw out the certainties that run from the thought to make a certain line of thinking.
Okay.
And what Heidegger says is, he calls his philosophy at some point deconstruction,
Okay.
because he's trying to deconstruct the certainty and the clarity of the tradition, and show its dark sides and its crevices and places where it doesn't make sense. And so deconstruction gets taken up by some thinkers like Jacques Derrida and others, and they begin to run with it and sort of do things with it that certainly Heidegger would not have done, and I don't think Arendt would have found it that valuable. And then this idea, this word emerges that some people use and throw around, postmodernism, again, which I don't understand. So, you know, if you ask me about it, I have to tell you, having studied this stuff for 40 years and read all about it and read people who are supposedly, I don't understand what the word means.
Okay.
It's never been a term that makes any sense to me.
Okay.
And so I can't tell you who is and who isn't a postmodernist because I just don't understand what the word means. Um, uh, Arendt is someone who doesn't believe that we should try to put the tradition back together again such that the answers come from philosophy. She doesn't think there are answers there.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that she thinks that philosophy is worthless or that we should just play with philosophy and we can have fun with it or some, which is what some people seem to think or argue. But it does mean that for her, the activity of thinking / philosophy has to be willing to build meaning and find meaningful common sense worlds from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Got you. Got you.
Uh,
Very
um,
helpful.
and
Very
and
helpful.
and so thinkers like Derrida, right, on one level can be very helpful in that regard because what they do is they show the unthought in a lot of philosophy, much like Heidegger did, and show us the danger of coherence and the danger of attempting to make to give an answer to these questions through philosophy. Whether they're helpful in the Arendtian project of thinking in and acting in a world in which we build new ideas of common sense from the bottom up is, I think, an open question and would depend on each thinker and reading them and how they act. I don't find it helpful to sort of say postmodernism is good or bad because I don't understand it.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Tim.
Good afternoon, Roger. It's always a pleasure when I find time to get here. Julie got my brain thinking about thinking and appearing at the same time. And it seems to me that in those cases, when one is appearing or displaying at the same time as thinking, we are basically reacting to an environment. It's reactive thinking. And we can choose to be pro-social, or we can choose to be lost in our thought and really not connect in those situations. So when we step back into our homeroom, we think a lot about what happened in the world during our times of appearance or our times of display. And that was one thought I had, and I thought you might jam on that for a minute. But I also wanted to figure out what the second proposition is, because I merged what you were saying about the first proposition into the second. And what is the dividing line between the first and the second proposition? What is the proposition two?
Well, again, I didn't mean for this to be like so, I mean, these propositions are not like so separate and set. But the second one is, she says that the manifestations of the thinking ego's authentic experiences are manifold. Among them are the metaphysical fallacies, right, such as the two-world theory and the non-theoretical descriptions of thinking as a kind of dying.
Mm-hmm.
So the second proposition is that these authentic semblances, which are not real, right, that there's this pure thinking or that the thinking is like dying,
Mm-hmm.
are still nevertheless meaningful as authentic semblances. The third is that all of the oddities of thinking, right, which includes the first proposition, that it's out of order, and the second that it's based in these authentic semblances, are based in the fundamental fact that it withdraws from the world.
Mhm.
And so you know, those are those are the second and third propositions. Again, she simply she this is a matter of review, right? I mean, she's just trying to help us think through some of the points she's made. These are not supposed to be taken as dogmas or propositions, but help us to re-engage with the what she said about thinking throughout the book.
Mhm.
Can you say more about the first question you wanted me to respond to?
Yeah, this idea between thinking or the situation we find ourselves where we're thinking and appearing at the same time, and we go in and we're sort of contemplating and planning what to do next, and that's all reactive thinking. But I'm wondering how that reaction goes when we take that reaction back to our own contemplations of how we were in that situation. In other words, we're taking the immediate past, bringing it back into our thought, and having it inform our general thinking, um, what we do in contemplation by ourselves. Catching what I'm meaning? In other words, it's always the appearing self um, coming back and informing our own personal experience informs how we think. We cannot think outside our experience to a certain extent.
Well, that's a great question. That's an interesting question. I mean, we've never experienced, a unicorn,
Mhm.
and yet we can think it.
Yeah.
Now, we've experienced a horse and a rhinoceros,
Yeah.
um, and we've experienced magical. Well, maybe we haven't experienced magic. I don't know. The point is, for our end, thinking is pretty much free from the world of experience, and yet it's tied to it in language, and that's the productive tension that really runs through much of the second and third chapters. Or how do you that thinking is both tied and free, metaphorically bound back, and yet also um free from the world, which is both the brilliance and promise of thinking, but also the danger of thinking. Um, and so, to what extent thinking is connected to our experience or tied to our experience, is actually a good one. And I think I've mentioned this before, but if you look at the early paintings that try and represent scientists, so I'm thinking largely of Vermeer's painting of the 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 geographer and another one. They're not people who are sitting there in a laboratory doing experiments. They're people in a study staring out the window,
Mhm.
lost in thought. Um and
Yeah.
and so uh there's a certain radical freedom in thinking that we need to come to grips with. That again is both liberating, but also wildly dangerous insofar as it frees us from common sense and allows us to
Yeah.
build, ideologies that,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know, can be quite damaging.
Yeah, the abstractions of ideology tends, I noticed that demagogues tend to use the tensions between opposites a lot. They'll talk about strong and weak. They'll talk about um, beautiful and ugly. They'll talk about smart and intelligent. And they'll take those tensions and use them to rather humiliate people. You're not smart, you're dumb. You're not ugly, you're beautiful. But whatever those tensions are, and those tensions seem to be an inherent part of our language. So if we think in language, as Arendt says, then aren't we generally taking tensions that circulate in the political sphere?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the dangers. Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks,
Uh,
Roger.
Clara. Hi, Clara. Are you there? I'm not here. Is it me? Hello?
You can hear me? Can
Now
you
I
hear
hear you.
me?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay. Hello, Professor Roger and
Hi,
dear
Clara.
colleagues. Okay, I want to say three things. One, that I really like the free association that you made between an unicorn and a honest politician. That's really, I mean, I like your sense of humor. For a second point, that I really liked all the exercise that you have made with us through these last weeks in terms of shed light upon this text, because I think it's brilliant, this text, and the one that is coming, the willing. But the way you try to explain, I feel that you don't only put your heart, your head, your mind, but your heart. And that's the difference that I found in your teaching or in your guidance. So I'm grateful for that. And finally, um, I understand that thinking seems to be a political marginal activity. And I agree with that, with what Arendt says in this phrase. What does it mean to you personally in your real life in this moment that is very interesting, although every moment in history is interesting. But what is your interpretation of that, I say, of that sentence in your own experiential, in your own experience?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to know.
Thank you. Well, thanks for your comments. You know, what I take personally from Arendt on thinking is the provocation to think for oneself. If thinking is saying what is, if thinking is freeing oneself from convention, is freeing oneself from the world as it is, if thinking is abstracting from the world, I take it as a provocation to be free and think for oneself. That's the first part of my answer to your question. The second is that I am at all times in my thinking trying to remind myself of the dangers of thinking, namely the dangers of universalism, the dangers of abstraction, the dangers of the loss of common sense, something that's so rampant in, for example, political theory or philosophy today. People who get caught up in theories, whether it's Marxist theory or post-colonial theory or deconstructive theory or postmodernist theory, to go back to Hannah's question, right? And they get caught up in building theories and they lose sight of the world.
Mm,
And so far as language ties us to the world, they start playing with words, right? And this is the problem with, I think, of that Hannah was referring to. I didn't want to get into it, but to the extent that people of all types who are theorists start, making words dance and do things that don't really tie us back to the world, they lose their meaning, they lose their sense, and they lose their capacity to move us. So I think Arendt, this book on thinking is important for those two reasons, that it frees me to, and frees us and should free us to think for ourselves, to stop and think, to be independent. And yet it reminds us of the incredible danger of thinking from an abstract point of view and to remind ourselves. So, just to give an example, the conference we had last year at the Arendt Center on tribalism and cosmopolitanism, it reminds us that universalism is a beautiful idea, is a freeing ourselves from the tribal elements that are often racist, prejudiced, whatever. And yet it also reminds us of the dangers of cosmopolitanism, that it's not tied to a world and can forget basic human needs for loyalty and trust with people who you've built relationships with over time in a community or a tribe. And so I think her text on thinking works in those two directions that are necessary at the same time.
mhm.
Gracias, Professor Roger.
Thank you. Julie, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back just for a minute.
All
I
right,
just
we only
wanted
have
to,
we really only have a minute. And I know
Okay, it'll be a
James has a
quick-
question too. So quickly.
okay, quickly, back to the linearity. She says that the only way of being able to express your thoughts is in words. And words as well have a linearity to them. One word follows upon the other, and that's how we make sense of things. And Wittgenstein brought this up when she was questioning the relationship between the words and the thinking. That's all that I wanted to say. You can move on to James.
Okay, thank you, Julie.
you.
I appreciate it. James, you want to have
Thanks.
a last question? Quickly. Are you there, James? Earth to James.
You're too kind, Roger. Earth to James. I don't know if James is in the earth. He's in the void.
Yeah.
On the bottom of page 209, by the forces of past and future, and thus protected against the void. It remains bound to and is rooted in the present, an entirely human present, though it is fully actualized only in the thinking process and lasts no longer than this process lasts. That whole paragraph is driving me nuts. I don't think I think the question is too long, and we'll take it up next time.
All right. We may have to, because we're out of time today.
Okay.
But thank you. And thank you all.
Just one question. Where is the void?
Where is the void? The void is a limit. The absolute void can be a limiting boundary concept, right? Hence, it is not inconceivable, but it is unthinkable. Obviously, if there is absolutely nothing, there can be nothing to think about.
I understand perfectly.
Good. There you go. I'm glad.
Have a good weekend, Roger. I'll see you soon.
See you guys in 2 weeks. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Enjoy reading Hannah